I thought I'd tell you, first of all, that Aspen and physicists really dates to the Manhattan Project because the physicists at Los Alamos needed a place to go for vacation. And George Kistiakowsky, my father knew about Aspen because they had been here in 41, but when they were looking for a place to go on a vacation, Aspen didn't really occur to them until Kistiakowsky recommended it. And so the physicists from Los Alamos started coming here routinely and regularly, starting in about 1945. And, they didn't all come, but many of them did. And you have to realize that in those days, in the 40s and the 50s, the only people who walked in the mountains were either Europeans or physicists, and usually both. Well, Europeans or scientists, and usually both. So if you came here and went on a walk, or if you went to Yosemite and went walking on the high trails, or if you went to the Canadian Rockies and went walking in the Canadian Rockies, or if you went to Glacier National Park and went walking in Glacier National Park, and you ran across somebody on the path, walking, not camping, not fishing, but walking in the trails, it was about even money that the person was European, and about 40% that the person was a scientist. And half of the people who were the scientists who were doing the walking were the physicists. And so, for example, we went to Lake Louise, which is in the Canadian Rockies, in 1950. Quite independent of our being there, there was Emilio Segre, who was a famous physicist who was at Berkeley. There were two other known European American physicists in Lake Louise that same summer. All independent of each other. Now, Lake Louise was not the Canadian Rockies were not the sort of Mecca resort area then that they are now. In fact, the area around Banff was suffering because nobody was coming to stay. People had, the resorts had been built around 1900 because the Canadian Pacific Railroad wanted reasons for people to travel on the railroad from Toronto and so on out to the west. And so they built these resorts. They're glorious. I don't know if you've ever been up there, but the Hotel Banff is one of the great hotels in the world. The Chateau at Lake Louise is certainly one of the great hotels in the world. The scenery is unbelievable, and the walks are great. But as I say, when you met somebody there was a good chance they were Europeans who had transplanted and or scientists. Well, Aspen was a natural place for these people who liked to walk in the mountains to come, and they started coming in 1945, and they kept coming. And Aspen was sort of I had never come, but my parents came regularly. They came in 47, they came in 49, they came in 52 or 53, I don't know which. In those years, my sister and I were deposited in a camp for the 2 or 3 weeks that my parents took as a vacation. And I hated camp. I absolutely hated camp.
Yes, I absolutely believe it. I can't see you in camp.
I was not a camper. So in 57, I put my foot down and said, I am not going to camp. And so when they came here, I came with them. And by that time, the Aspen Institute existed, and there had started to be a relationship between scientists and the Institute. The sort of takeover by, what shall I call it, philosophers and so on, had not yet occurred. And there were a lot of scientists who would come to the Institute for a week or for 2 weeks. My father wasn't one of them that year. But in '61 he was. And there wasn't yet the separation of the Center for Physics and the Aspen Institute. But a reasonable number of the people who went to the Institute were physicists. In one of my classmates in high school was Peter Salk, who was Jonas Salk's son. And when I came in '61, who was here at the Institute? Jonas Salk with his son. So there was some history there. So I came the first time in '57. My only interaction with the Institute was this story that I told the other day about going to a lecture by Mortimer Adler, who was a very famous philosopher and a very important person, as I have since learned, in the sort of long-term history of the Institute, because he's really the source of forcing the physicists out of the Institute and into a separate entity. He was very jealous of the physicists. Well, in 1957, Mortimer Adler gave a lecture in which, as I would put it, he totally confused the words belief and knowledge. Because he said science was a matter of belief, religion and politics are a matter of knowledge. Now, I have a classical scientific background. I'm not a scientist, but I grew up with one. And how can you sit and say that science is not knowledge, it's only belief, but the existence of God is knowledge? Or the fact that communism is the best way to run a country is knowledge, which Mortimer Adler believed until 1936. And then he converted. Now, I would have said that if you can convert, then it wasn't knowledge to begin with, and it ain't knowledge afterwards. My father had various important routines all his life. One of them is well known, that when he got up, he took a bath that lasted about 45 minutes, and the bath was designed to get his thoughts in order and for him to set himself an agenda for the day. The other routine all his life, the other major routine all his life, was that we went walking every Sunday, and there were 2 weeks or 3 weeks during the summer where we went to the mountains and walked. And this was a function, he would never have said it this way, but this was for him a way of both getting the exercise, because he didn't do anything else for exercise, and cleaning his mind out of all the clutter that was gathered over the course of the week or of the year. And he found the mountains to be by far the best place. He could look at the mountains. There's a picture which you can find in Physics Today. There was a memorial issue about my father. And there's a wonderful picture of my father at the age of about 23, sitting on a rock on top of a mountain, gazing out over the world. And I think it's one of the great pictures of all time. But you left the house at 9 or thereabouts and went to wherever you were going to walk, and you walked for about 6 or 7 hours, and you got back to the house at about 4. And then there was the evening to deal with. Well, Mortimer Adler was giving a talk that evening, so why not? So we went to the talk. Mortimer Adler was a famous person already. He had gone to the University of Chicago and rather drastically changed the way that Chicago taught its undergraduates, because he introduced the concept of teaching out of great books, with the notion that, for example, Aristotle's physics was far more important because Aristotle wrote a great book than, let's say, the physics of the 20th century, because that was inaccessible to him. And he convinced the president of Chicago at the time, who's very famous, and I don't remember his name. Anyway, he convinced him to make this change, and all the freshmen and sophomores went through 2 years of reading great books. So he was here, and he was giving this talk, and why not go to it? So we went to it, right? And one of the nice things about the Institute's lectures is that the following afternoon or evening, there would be a roundtable discussion of what had happened in the lecture. And so, anyway, this discussion that science is belief and religion is knowledge somewhat upset my, at the very least, agnostic and probably atheistic father, who had a deep-seated belief, shared by most of his colleagues, that science is knowledge, not belief. So, anyway, Adler and 3 other people, and I want to say that Paul Nietzsche was one of them, because we met Paul Nietzsche here. Nietzsche. Here, yeah, in Aspen. And I think that he was one of the panelists. And when my father stood up and made his wonderful demonstration, where he took out a Swiss Army knife, opened up the blade, and said to Mortimer Adler, "Now I know that if I let go of this knife, that it will fall. I also know that the blade is very sharp, and that if someone were to put their hand underneath where the blade will fall, the blade will stick in their hand." And I know that. And Adler said, so he suggested to Adler that if he thought that this was only a belief, that he hold out his hand and they would make the experiment, because from experiments you can derive knowledge. And I believe it was Nietzsche who then said, well, we all should defer in matters of science to Hans Bethe. And Adler said, perhaps, but miracles do happen. Los Alamos was a totally isolated, totally secret installation, and when the poor Army kids got assigned to Los Alamos, they never left until August of 1945. It was a black hole that sucked them in and didn't let them go. We would go to Europe every 3 years, and when we went to Europe, they went to Zermatt. And when they didn't go to Europe, we almost always went to Los Alamos, and if we went to Los Alamos, they came to Aspen. It was just a natural conjunction of things. So in 1957, I came as a 13-year-old. That was my first trip here. And we were here for 2 weeks. The first 3 days that we were here, I went on the walks with them. On the 4th day, I didn't want to go on a walk. I mean, 3 days of walking, I was ready to do something different. This is something that 13-year-olds do. They have, and we were very lucky. We were staying in some cabins that were owned by some people named Maxwell. And Mr. Maxwell, who was probably 60 at the time, said, well, leave him with me, and I'll teach him how to fish. So they left me with Mr. Maxwell, and Mr. Maxwell had a large pond. Mr. Maxwell lived next to Maroon Creek, and he had a deal with the Colorado State Fisheries people that they would give him a lot of the fry trout at the beginning of the season, and he would let them grow up in his pond, and then when they reached a reasonable size, he would release them into Maroon Creek, thus providing the fishermen in Maroon Creek with fish to fish. Makes sense, doesn't it? So, but the idea was to let these fish grow to about 7, 8, 9 inches so that they could defend themselves when they got into Maroon Creek, where there were large fish. And large fish eat smaller fish. But so I was taken down to the side of the pond, handed a rod, shown how to tie a fly on the end of the line, and a sinker and a float, and he taught me how to cast. And I would throw the fly out into the middle of that pond, and after I'd done it for 40 minutes or so, one of those trout decided this was a nice-looking fly and bit it. And so I landed a fish. And that was very exciting. So I said, can I try again? And he said, sure. So we spent about 3.5, 4 hours with me throwing flies into this pond and pulling out fish every once in a while. And by the end of the day, I had 6, as I recall, 6 fish between 7 and 9 inches, which is not enormous, but large enough to be edible. And then he showed me how to clean them. He did most of the cleaning. And then I took them home, and I got home at just about when my parents arrived. I think that was planned, and proudly showed my mother that we had 6 fish to eat that night. Who could ask for anything more? That was the only time I went. Having done that, I was then prepared to go walking again. But I needed a day off. And in the evenings, sometimes we went to the music festival already existed, and once or twice we went to music, but my father had no ear for music, so we didn't go there very often. And occasionally, I think twice during the 2 weeks, we went to the lectures. The second one I don't remember at all, so it was probably not worth it, but I'm sure we went. That was the only time I was really here as a young kid, as a relatively young kid. Up until then, Aspen had been for grown-ups only, at least in our family. The next time I came, I'm fairly sure was 1961. And I was on my way. The trip in 1961 is actually distinguished not by the time in Aspen, but by the fact that my father and I attempted to climb something called Kit Carson Peak, which is about 90 miles southeast of here, above Alamosa. And we went up, and for one of the few times that my father's ever done this, we carried tents and we slept overnight below the peak, and started to go up. And to go up Kit Carson, you go up to a ridge. And the day was glorious on the side that we were on. Got up to the ridge, and there was this mass of clouds pouring up from the west, from the southwest. And I said to my father, we're not going the rest of the way. And he was really annoyed at that, seriously annoyed at that. But I said to him, you promised. I had done some mountain climbing training, and the last part of Kit Carson, you have to rope up. It's fairly tricky rock climbing. And I didn't want to be on those rocks with my father, who was then 55 and weighed significantly more than I did. I didn't want to be on those rocks if they got slippery, and he slipped. I didn't want to be on those rocks if they got slippery and I slipped, because I was quite sure that my father couldn't hold me. So I said, we're going back down, and this occasioned about a 20 or 30-minute argument, which he finally decided I had been right when we were about halfway down the scree slope that we had to go down, and it started to hail with sort of dime-size hail. And I said, just think if we were up on, and we could look up, and we couldn't see the mountains because they were covered by the clouds. And I said, now, would you really want to have been up there when this started coming down? And he said, no, but I wanted to be up there. And so then we spent a couple weeks here, and I don't remember much about it. By then, that year, my father was in fact associated with the Institute, and the Institute had found us lodging. Prior to that, we had always stayed with the Maxwells, who came in '47 and had this cabin, these cabins. The Maxwells are important to Aspen generally. Their daughter and son-in-law, their son-in-law was an architect who designed, as far as I know, several of the municipal buildings, and was a very good architect. And they had one of the great houses in all of history that was on Maroon Creek, and that, you know, you went to it and you said, can I live here? Joy and Sam Caudill are just the nicest people. And anyway, I came back again in '65. And in '65, there was a separate physics center for the first time. And my father was at the center, but there was still the Aspen Institute, and there was quite close relationships between the people at the Institute and the people at the center in those days still. I don't know what it's like now, but I gather that the more you have your own campus, the less interaction there probably is. That was a sort of glorious summer for me, because, first of all, the weather was superb for the 2 weeks we were here. Not one day did it rain. There were a bunch of young people up here from Los Alamos, including Mike Nieto, and we did several expeditions. We went over Buckminster Pass and down to Snowmass one time. It was the first time I climbed Castle Peak. We went up to the basin just below Independence Pass and walked for about 5 hours up to the ridge and then back down. And on most of those expeditions, people would sort into one group talking physics, and one group talking politics, and one group trying to cope with the various non-physics, which would usually include my mother and various wives and other grown. There weren't many young children that year, but there were a lot of 17 to 25-year-olds, probably a dozen of us. So, I mean, some of these expeditions were 20, 30 people. Certainly the one that went over Buckminster, there were 14 people who went up from Maroon Lake to the pass and down to Snowmass, and 12 people who came up from Snowmass to the pass and down to Maroon Lake. And in those days, you didn't have to take a bus up to Maroon Lake. So what you did was you described very carefully where you had parked your car. When you handed the keys to the person who was going to go down to your car and drive it back and meet you at Aspen Highlands, probably. I also, that year there was a performance, I didn't go to the music very often, but that year there was a very strange performance of the first time ever performance of Bartók's Concerto for Percussion. And I thought that sounded interesting, so we went. And it was very interesting because it was all percussion. There were no strings, no piano, no horns or woodwinds or anything, just drums, a xylophone, a triangle, cymbals, and it all worked. I never found a recording of it. I looked. And it was first performed here at the music festival. We stayed at the Maxwell's, but on the last day before we were about to leave to leave Aspen, we had dinner at the Caudilles. And they had the river right behind the house. And Sam said, well, now that you learned how to cast into that pond, would you like to learn how to cast into the river? Of course I would. So we had gotten there about 4 o'clock, and at about 4:30, Sam and I went down to the river, and he started showing me how to throw how to cast my fly onto the Maroon, which is a very rapidly running creek at that point. And lo and behold, I actually caught a fish. But we threw it back. Not because it was too small, but because we already knew what we were eating, and there was no point in having a fish that we weren't going to eat. Somebody else could catch him some other time. I will say this. There really is nothing much better to eat in the world than trout that you have caught yourself that day. There isn't. I remember one year when we were traveling west, we came to a restaurant, and I'd like to say it was in Idaho, where behind the restaurant they had a trout pond, and you were invited to catch your own dinner, which was an absolutely wonderful idea. Now, I did catch my own dinner. In fact, I caught dinner for all 4 members of the family at that, because my father didn't want to do it. My father couldn't throw anything to save himself. My father And my mother didn't want to do it, and my sister tried once and said, I can't do this. So I caught 4 fish, and we had fresh rainbow trout for dinner. Fresh caught. I mean, caught, delivered to the restaurant, they cleaned it, they cooked it, they delivered it to your table. And all of these were 12 to 15-inch fish, so it was a real full meal. It was a lot of fun. I mean, what a great idea for a restaurant, you must admit. The only thing I'd like to add to that is what my mother just wrote we're giving a copy of a book that was just published called Hans Bethe, His Life in Physics. You don't happen to have that with you, do you? I'm supposed to write the dedication into it.
Thank goodness you reminded me.
And what she wanted to say there was that my father believed that there really couldn't be anything more wonderful than a place where you had physics and mountains. And that was Aspen. And I think he's right. I mean, I don't do the physics, but a place where you can expand your mind and go into the mountains and both get exercise and expand your spirit, I can't imagine anything better.